Welcome to another quiet journey through time. One told not through epic battles or loud legends, but through the soft rustle of woolen cloaks, the steady crackle of hearthfire, and the whispered resilience of a people who learned to survive when the world turned dark and cold. Tonight, we travel north, far north, to the icebound shores and snow-laden forests of the Viking world, of how real people, with calloused hands and weathered spirits, faced some of the coldest nights in history, and hand-woven wool turned back the frost, and how even animals slept beside their owners just to share heat. We'll explore Viking winter rituals, meals of dried fish and sour milk, and the flickering hope carried in stories told around the fire. A land where winter was not a season, but a test of it helps us keep the fire going and bring more sleepy stories to your nights, where the sun disappeared for weeks at a time, and families huddled in longhouses carved into the earth, praying for warmth, food, and the return of light. Forget the horned helmet myths. This is not the tale of conquest, but of quiet survival. But because we tell it softly, slowly, with just enough texture to soothe your mind and quiet the world outside your window. When the sun did appear, it barely lifted above the horizon. These weren't grand wooden halls like in modern shows. They were damp, dark, often crowded. It found every gap in the thatch, every loose board, every tiny hole in a fur-lined cloak. And the people inside had to learn how to live with that, not in resistance, but in uneasy harmony. Yes, animals often lived inside with the family during the coldest months. It helped conserve heat. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. They didn't conquer the cold. They worked around it. They respected it. And sometimes they feared it. Not drama, not battle, for warmth, for daylight, for the cycle of survival to begin again. Just survival. The thatched roofs were weighted with snow. The walls were packed with mud and moss. Inside, it was smoky. Smoky, always. The hearth fire rarely went out, because relighting it from scratch was difficult, and fire meant survival. The light was cold and indirect, casting long shadows over frozen fields, and when it disappeared again it felt final. You'll hear how longhouses were built to trap warmth. How fur-lined boots imagine waking up in a Viking longhouse on a bitter January morning. The air bites at your nose, even while you're still buried under thick wool and fur blanket. Someone is stirring the fire, trying to coax a new flame from yesterday's coals. And outside, the world is still, too cold even for the snow to fall. You hear the soft breathing of your family nearby, all packed close together on shared sleeping platforms for warmth. This is boring history for sleep. Not boring because the past lacks wonder. They told stories, they sang softly while working, they passed down wisdom about the weather, about the land, about the sky, in whispers and lullabies. They measured time not by clocks, but by the shifting patterns of darkness and the sounds of nature returning as spring inched closer. So, lay back. Let your breathing slow. Let the snow fall outside and the flames flicker gently in your imagination. And the icy forests of Sweden, to the windswept hills of Denmark, and the bleak outer islands of Scotland and Iceland. These were not mild places. Winter often arrived early and stayed long. Snow blanketed the earth, not for days or weeks, but for entire seasons. And the sun, it could vanish for days at a time. And before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the overlooked corners of the past, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let's begin. Before we can understand how the Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year, we have to picture where they lived. Not just in maps or legends, but in the quiet reality of everyday life. The Viking world stretched across the northern reaches of Europe. From the deep fjords of Norway in the far north, winter meant darkness. Not just chilly afternoons, but entire months, with only a few hours of grey twilight each day. Homes were built low to the ground. Long houses, mostly made of turf, timber, and thick sod. The wind outside could scream across the land like a living thing. In this first segment, we're going to settle into this world, slowly, gently. A cow snorts quietly from the far end of the room. You can smell the hearthwood smoke, old embers, the faint scent of fish stew cooked the night before. This was the daily backdrop of Viking winter life. But even here, in the frozen north, people found ways to endure. And in the deep, muffled quiet of the longhouse, warmed by a single, struggling fire, they waited. If there was one element at the heart of Viking winter survival, it was the fire. Not just for cooking or light, But as the literal center of life in the darkest, coldest season, the Viking hearth wasn't grand or decorative. It was functional, smoky, and deeply essential. Positioned in the center of the longhouse floor, the hearth was a shallow pit of glowing coals, with thick stones or iron grates used to balance pots above the flame. Viking longhouses were engineered not for beauty, but for warmth and practicality. The walls were thick, built from timber planks and packed with layers of mud, dung, and straw to stop the icy wind from slipping through. Some houses even used turf, whole layers of earth and grass stacked over wooden frames, creating something more like a cave than a house. But that's what worked. Dirt, straw, and moss made surprisingly good insulation. Letting it die meant hours of cold work to start it again, with flint and steel, or fire-striking stones, and dry kindling that was increasingly hard to come by as winter dragged on. Many families preserved coals overnight in small clay vessels wrapped in ash to keep them warm until morning. There was no chimney, only a hole in the thatched roof through which smoke slowly drifted out. In some areas, driftwood washed up along coastal shores became precious winter fuel, gathered long in advance and stacked under the eaves to dry. And this wasn't the soft, modern wool you'd find in a store today. Men wore trousers made of wool or layered with strips of fur, while women wore full-length wool dresses or overdress, often cinched with belts that held knives, tools, or keys. Cloaks were often double-layered in colder climates, sometimes felted for extra insulation, and made longer in winter to wrap around the body entirely. While the richest households might flaunt white ermine or imported silks, even humble families trapped rabbits, foxes, or squirrels to make fur linings and collars. The soles were flat and soft, meant to flex with the foot rather than protect from the cold ground. In deeper snow, they might be lined with animal skins, or tied higher up the leg with strips of leather to keep snow out. Bear fur was particularly prized, not just for its thickness, but for its symbolism. Wearing bear was a mark of strength and prestige. It was thick, heavy, coarse, and full of natural lanolin, which helped make it water. Staying outside for too long meant numbing fingers, frozen toes, and the creeping sting of frostbite, because in the winter lands of the north, once your core body temperature dropped, recovery was slow and often too late. And stepped out into the swirling snow, hood drawn low, boots crunching softly over frozen ground, fur stiff with frost. Most people learned to move quickly, to finish outdoor chores in bursts, and to return to the hearth as soon as possible. Viking women who were master weavers would spin the wool tight for warmth, or loose and fluffy for padding. For particularly rough weather, people wrapped their hands in fur-lined cloth. Not dexterous, but effective. Every piece of clothing was labor-intensive and valuable, handed down, patched, and repurposed for generations. It wasn't just fashion, it was insulation. There were no clocks, no distractions, just the creak of the wood above, the slow pop of peat in the fire, and the muffled world outside wrapped in snow. They wore woolen hoods, some attached to cloaks, or caps made of felt and fur. In regions battered by strong sea winds, sealskin, or thick pelts, might be fashioned into rough, wind-breaking hats. Cold air, being heavier, settled low, so the sleeping platforms were built higher up, raised above the ground. In many homes, the air was still cold enough to see your breath in the mornings. Frost crept across the inside of walls. Water leapt and wooden cups froze overnight. People adapted not by changing the weather, but by changing their expectations. People slept close together under layers of sheepskins, woolen cloaks, and fur blankets, conserving body heat in communal warmth. It was a smoky experience, especially in still air, and children often developed a cough by midwinter, and sometimes chickens were brought into the longhouse, not just for protection, but for heat. The warmth of livestock body heat added a few precious degrees to the living space. It was unpleasant, smelly, cramped, but essential. But without it, the household would not last long. Cloaks made of thick wool were hung on the walls, not just for convenience, but because they added another layer of fabric against the cold. Every scrap of fur, felt, or woven cloth was put to use, sometimes stitched into crude wall hangings to trap heat inside. Insulation wasn't about luxury, it was a matter of life and death. The thatched roofs were steeply pitched, not just to let snow slide off, but to create an air pocket under the eaves where warmth could collect. Even the animals were part of this ecosystem. During the coldest months, cows, goats, clothing, too, acted like a second layer of insulation, for both people and the home. And while most of us today are used to a thermostat keeping things consistent, Viking homes relied on vigilance. Someone always had to tend a fire. When firewood ran low, they burned peat dug from bogs and dried during the summer. It didn't burn hot, but it was enough. But even with all this preparation, the inside of a longhouse never got truly warm by modern standards. It was just less cold, and so each long, bitter night was passed in the soft flicker of firelight. People huddled in wool, sipping thin broth, telling stories, or simply waiting out the darkness. When the longhouse wasn't enough, and venturing outside was unavoidable, whether to gather firewood, tend to animals, or protect the homestead, Viking survival depended on clothing that could stand up to brutal Nordic winters. But there were no zippers, no synthetic insulation, just clever, patient layering, and materials borrowed from the animals they raised or hunted. Wool was the cornerstone of Viking winter, where it was everywhere, in cloaks, tunics, socks, mittens, even undergarments. The basic outfit started with a woolen tunic layered over an under, sometimes made of linen in warmer months, but replaced with more wool in winter. Over that came the cloak, usually fastened with a brooch at the right shoulder, so the right arm stayed free for work or defense. But what truly set Viking winter clothing apart was their use of fur. Fur wasn't just for nobility. Viking boots were made of leather, often stuffed with straw or wool for warmth. Hands were protected with thick woolen mittens, sometimes layered with deerskin. Head coverings were essential. Heat leaves the body quickly through the head, and Vikings knew it well. Even the beard served a purpose. For Viking men, thick beards helped protect the face from frostbite, catching snow and ice before it could freeze the skin. But there was no such thing as a truly warm Viking outfit. Wearing layers wasn't just about warmth, it was about survival. So they wrapped up tight, whispered short prayers to Thor or Freya. Food, in the Viking world, was never just nourishment. It was a seasonal rhythm, a survival skill, and in winter, a matter of life and death. When the seas froze, the soil hardened, and the sun barely crept above the horizon, meals had to come from storage, planning, and no small amount of luck. There were no supermarkets, no central heating to grow crops indoors. The Viking diet in winter was a testament to patience and preparation, months of work that culminated in the hope that you'd preserved enough to last until the thaw. At the heart of Viking winter cuisine was preservation. Fish, especially herring, cod, and salmon, were caught during warmer months and dried, smoked, or salted. The sour taste might be strong to modern tongues, but for Viking families, it was a crucial fat source in the lamest months. Rows of fish would hang on wooden racks, stiff and gray in the cold air, awaiting the frost. It might sound unappetizing, but it was warm, filling, and could be stretched to feed a large family. Ale and mead were safer, lightly fermented, sometimes flavored with herbs or honey, but this was reserved for feasts, or for the sick and dying. A parent might ladle gruel into carved wooden bowls, while children huddled under furs, too tired to speak. Even children drank diluted ale, warmed by the fire, and flavored with sweet roots when possible. Meat from pigs, cattle, or hunted animals was also cured, buried in pits, or packed in salt if they could afford it. Some families thinned the gruel, skipped meals, or foraged for bark and moss when supplies ran low. There were stories, quiet, unspoken, of desperate choices, of survival at any cost, biting into hard bread, dipping it into broth, scraping the last grains from a wooden cup. And in a land where the wind could howl for days, and snow could bury entire villages, building a home wasn't about comfort, it was about enjoyment. The roof, often sagging under snow, was made of wooden beams covered in straw or sod. Light came from the open hearth in the center, a long, shallow fire that burned day and night. The smoke crept slowly upward, curling toward the dark rafters before seeping through the thatch. It breathed just enough to keep smoke from choking everyone inside, but not so much that it let the heat escape. Low to the ground, with sloping thatched roofs and thick turf banks lining the walls, but it was home, and more importantly, it was warm. The snow piled up against the walls, and doors were sometimes blocked entirely. Wooden shutters were nailed down tight. Icicles crept from the eaves like teeth. But inside, there was heat, breath, and life. Women spun thread by hand, wool scraped from summer shearing, now dyed with root and lichen. These were covered with animal skins, straw, and the thickest wool blankets a family could weave. And if you were lucky, you didn't feel the cold. not until morning, when the fire burned low and frost kissed the edges of the thatch. Stories were told, slowly, softly, of gods and giants, of old voyages, of family feuds, long resolved or still brewing. In the far back, sometimes, livestock huddled behind a partition, chickens clucking softly, goats snuffling the hay, their breath visible in the cold air. It was the thin wall between life and the endless dark. But that was the point. The goal was not grandeur, but insulation. Everyone, grandparents, parents, children, lived, slept, cooked, and sometimes gave birth or died in that one open space. So the fire was fed carefully, a rhythm of dried dung, seaweed, driftwood, and splinters of hardwood, all rationed by the season. In colder regions, it was sometimes simply frozen outdoors in sealed clay containers. Dairy products were fermented or transformed into hard cheese and sour butter, thick, pungent. In hard times, bark flour or ground acorns were mixed in, adding bitterness and grit. Baking was done on hot stones, sometimes beneath coals, the smoke lending a permanent earthiness to the taste. Vegetables were scarce. Onions, leeks, turnips, and cabbages were common in the autumn, but by January, many were shriveled, moldy, or gone. Some households buried root vegetables in straw-lined pits to extend their life, hoping to draw from them in midwinter. One of the most dependable meals was gruel, a simple porridge made from barley or oats, sometimes mixed with bits of dried meat, sour whey, or fermented fish paste for flavor. A place where animals, families, and fire all coexisted in a single, smoky space for months on end. Pottage, too, made frequent appearances. A slow-cooked mixture of grains, beans, and any scrap of meat or bone available. A pot might stay over the fire for days, with ingredients added whenever something new became available. Bread, when available, was often made from coarse barley or rye, heavy, dark, and dense. And then there were the drinks. Water, especially in winter, wasn't always clean or accessible. Streams froze, wells iced over. Salt was rare and precious. So were spices. If a Viking family had access to trade, they might possess small amounts of imported pepper, dried herbs, or even cinnamon. Most days, meals were taken in silence, seated around the longhouse hearth. The fire popped and hissed. The soup steamed gently. There was no silverware, just fingers, shared spoons, or knives. And still, it wasn't always enough. Many winters ended in hunger, but for most, the food was not a joy. It was a necessity, a quiet defiance against the cold and the dark, spoonful by spoonful, and every meal, no matter how simple, was a victory. In the Viking world, survival didn't just depend on food or fire. It began with the walls that surrounded you. The Viking longhouse was more than just a shelter, it was a fortress against nature. From the outside, these homes didn't look like much. Stone or wooden frames were packed with clay, mud, and woven branches, then reinforced with layers of turf. Living grass that, once dry, acted as a natural barrier against the chill. Inside, it was dim and smoky. There were no windows. The fire did not blaze. Too much flame meant wasted fuel, which had to be gathered with great effort. Along the sides of the longhouse were raised wooden platforms. Benches by day, sleeping places by night. There were no separate rooms. Privacy didn't exist. The longhouse was not clean by modern standards. Dirt floored the center. Ash collected in corners. Fleas and lice were common. In the darkest parts of winter, days could pass without stepping outside. To pass the time, people repaired tools, carved small trinkets, mended clothes. Outside, the wind might scream like a dying beast. Children played in the shadows of the firelight. Elders dozed, wrapped in furs. Everything smelled of wood smoke, boiled broth, and damp wool. For the Vikings, a longhouse wasn't a luxury, and within those close, smoky walls, the long night passed. The Vikings didn't have down jackets or insulated boots. They faced their winters with what they had, and what they had, above all else, was wool. It was rough, scratchy. These sheep grazed across steep hillsides and rocky shores, their thick fleece soaked by rain and dried by salt air. The fibers were twisted into thread with drop spindles, one turn at a time, for hours, even days. The thread was then woven into cloth on upright looms, stretched tight with tension stones, and tightened slowly as each row was added. When shorn in summer, the wool was coarse but warm, perfect for weathering the bitter dark ahead. but it was life. Most Vikings relied entirely on wool and willpower. The lanolin and natural oil in sheep's wool made them somewhat water. Clothes were slept in, curled under blankets of sheepskin or woven wool to retain body heat. Children nestled between adults, and dogs might curl at their feet, sharing breath and warmth. The longer they were worn, the better they repelled wind and moisture. But even color was a luxury. Function came first. Wool was the backbone of Viking winter survival, a miracle fiber spun by hand, woven with care, and passed down between generations, and sewn with needles of bone or antler, using thread spun from sheep or flax. A single outfit might take weeks to complete. It might be worn for years. In the coldest months, it wrapped every part of the body, from head to toe, layered with care and patience. When torn it was when truly finished, it was burned for warmth. A final act of service. The wool began with the sheep, hardy, shaggy animals bred to withstand Nordic winds. They were not pampered. Women, often working by firelight, carded the raw wool with handheld combs. The fabric produced was not elegant, it was dense. Over that came a thicker tunic, belted at the waist. It didn't look like much, but when dried properly, peat could burn for hours. These bricks were laid out in the sun, too dry, stacked carefully, turned often, protected from rain. In longhouses, peat was burned in open hearths. The smoke vented through the roof, or sometimes not at all. The air could be thick, dark with soot, staining rafters and lungs alike. A single household might need thousands of peat bricks to make it through the winter. Socks, if worn, were also wool, sometimes felted for extra insulation. Resourcefully, the ocean carried them to shore, and Viking families would comb the beaches for days after a storm, dragging the precious wood inland like treasure. Dried and stacked like peat, cow and horse dung gave off a surprising amount of heat when burned. It was a last resort, but in places with no trees and no peat, it was better than freezing. Soft, red, steady, a quiet pulse in the cold. A Viking hearth was a low pit, often just a raised stone platform, set in the center of the longhouse. But it was survival. Around it, families gathered, warming hands, drying clothes, cooking broth, and sharing silence. It was dried, stacked, and rationed, too valuable to waste. You might still wake with frost on your blanket, your breath visible, your fingers stiff. What little birch or scrub willow grew was quickly harvested for building and fuel. And soon, it was gone. The forests never regrew. Cleaned, dried, and broken into pieces, bones could add a hot, crackling flame to an otherwise smoky fire. Without it, there was no cooking, no light, no heat to thaw frostbitten fingers or dry-soaked clothes. Quietly, with methods as ancient and inventive as the people themselves, shoes were made from leather, softened with animal fat, stuffed with straw, or lined with scraps of wool. Woolen trousers, sometimes bound with leg wraps, kept the wind from crawling up the legs. And over it all, a thick, hooded cloak, clasped with a brooch at the shoulder. This cloak was your second skin, stiff, built for defense. A Viking winter outfit began with a linen or woolen under tunic, if you could afford it. Cloaks were rarely washed. Children wore handmade owns, often many times patched. Scarves were rare, but woolen hoods and mittens were common, especially in the north. In some cases fur was added, wolf, fox, or bear, but this was rare and expensive. At night, people did not undress. Dyes were limited in winter. Most garments were natural brown, gray, off-white, or faintly green from lichen or nettle dye. Everything was made by hand. Every tunic, every mitten, every cloak. Measured, cut, wool was never thrown away. When worn thin, it was patched. In the silence of winter, as snow hissed against the longhouse walls, the whisper of wool on skin, the tug of cloth over shoulders, was the soft armor of the north. You didn't just wear wool in Viking winter, you survived in it. When you think of a Viking hearth, you might picture a roaring fire, fed by thick logs cut from deep forests. But much of the Viking world was treeless, wind-blasted coasts, rocky islands, high northern tundra where no trees grew tall enough to cut. So how did they stay warm? They adapted. In Iceland, for example, settlers arrived to find an island nearly barren of trees. That left the Icelanders and many Norse with a serious problem. Fire was life. So they turned to what the land could offer. One solution was driftwood, long salt-bleached timbers that floated across the North Atlantic from distant forests in Russia and Scandinavia. But driftwood was rare and unpredictable, so they turned also to peat, the black, dense soil found in marshes and wetlands, rich with centuries of decaying plants. Cutting peat was hard, wet work. In late summer, when the ground was soft, families carved the earth into bricks with sharp spades. Peat fires smelled of earth and smoke. They didn't burn hot like wood, but they smoldered steadily, perfect for slow heat and quiet cooking. But it kept the cold at bay. In coastal regions, Vikings also burned dung. Yes, animal droppings, bones, too, were used, especially from large animals. And in emergencies, even fishing nets, ship tar, or old ropes were burned. Fire was simply too important to be choosy. Every scrap was saved. Every twig, every chip of kindling. Children were taught to gather brush and dry moss, to build careful fires, and conserve every ember. There were no fireplaces, not in the way we imagine, and even with all their fuel, peat, driftwood, bone, the warmth barely reached the far corners of the house. But the hearth glowed on. It was not comfort as we know it, and, in the deep dark of Viking winter, survival was everything. Imagine the wind howling across a frozen field, snow tapping at the wooden walls like 1,000 tiny fingers, and a thick darkness pressing against the world outside. Inside, the Viking longhouse glows with a low amber light. It is smoky, but still quiet. The hearth burns at the center, not roaring, but steady. Around it, life slows to a whisper. This is where the Vikings slept. Not in beds as we know them, but in shared spaces, wrapped in cloaks and furs, pressed close for warmth and survival. One room, long and narrow, 30, 40, even 60 feet in length. Walls made of turf, stone, or timber, packed with straw or earth to hold back the cold. The longhouse was often the only building a family had. Along each side, raised wooden platforms stretched the length of the house. These were benches by day, beds by night, covered with hay woolen blankets and animal skins. The entire family, parents, children, elders, and sometimes even servants or slaves, all slept together, shoulder to shoulder. There was no privacy, no room for modesty, just warmth, shared body heat, and the deep understanding that survival meant staying close. People adapted by slowing down, sleeping longer, waking only to tend animals, add peat to the fire, or eat a quick bowl of porridge before retreating again to their furs. Not just for protection, but because their warmth added to the house's meager insulation. Their quiet breath steamed in the cold air. Their soft chewing was a nighttime lullaby. In those quiet hours of darkness, they were the entertainment. And sometimes, the only comfort. People froze in their sleep, especially the very old, or the very young. A risk everyone knew, but no one spoke of. A thin light through the thatched roof. The fire rekindled. Porridge stirred. Boots pulled on. Sometimes, even animals were brought inside. Sheep, goats, or young calves. The fire helped dry damp clothes, but often they remained damp anyway, heavy with the scent of smoke and earth. There were no pajamas. Most people slept in what they wore. Woolen tunics, heavy cloaks, perhaps even their boots. The coals of the hearth barely glowing red. Your breath visible in the icy morning air. Smoke from the fire rose up and swirled into the rafters, where soot painted the beams black over the years. Some longhouses had a small hole in the roof for the smoke to escape. Others didn't. Children might huddle between adults. Elders slept near the hearth, and the sick, if there were any, were wrapped in extra pelts and set close to the fire's edge. A few spoonfuls to warm the belly, sometimes flavored with goat milk, if any remained melted from snow, boiled over a smoky fire, and stored in wooden buckets. In the coldest times, even water was precious. If the household had seal fat or whale blubber, it might be rendered into a greasy broth that kept the body warm from the inside, where the warmth could reach fragile lungs. Inside them, salted cod, smoked lamb, barley cakes, and jars of sour cabbage, still clinging to flavor after months underground. The air was thick, sometimes choking. A scrap of mutton, a bitter wild root, and maybe, if the family was lucky, a pinch of dried herbs gathered in warmer months. In the deep of winter, light disappeared. The sun might rise only for a few hours each day. Nights lasted for what felt like an eternity. Sweet, golden, and warming. It was a flicker of joy in an otherwise hard season. On those nights, the house was warmer, smiles were easier, sleep came softer, but most days, they drank sour milk or thin beer made from old grains and herbs. Even the bread was rough, made with barley or rye, baked hard and flat, and sometimes filled with tree bark or ground bones to stretch it further. They dried fish, smoked meat, pickled vegetables, and fermented dairy. Nothing was wasted. It was a test. A slow challenge, one that separated the careless from the careful, the greedy from the wise, and the prepared from the doomed. A single spoiled batch of Skyer Viking yogurt could mean the difference between hunger and death. A pouch of black pepper could cost a fortune. Instead, they used onions, wild garlic, or juniper berries to give food a whisper of flavor. And they told stories. Passed wooden spoons, talked softly about the weather, the livestock, or the coming spring. Old legends, sagas passed down by memory, tales of gods, monsters, and voyagers across the sea. Stories soothed the mind, they softened the chill. There was no silence like a Viking winter night, only the sound of a fire popping, a child breathing, the wind singing against the roof. Sometimes, the cold was too much. The fire might burn low, supplies might run thin, but for those who made it through, morning came pale and gray, and the longhouse began again. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't soft, but it was warm enough. And in a world where cold could kill, that was everything. Picture yourself waking in the soft hush of a Viking longhouse. The first thought, food, not a feast, not fresh bread, not a warm mug of anything sweet, just something, anything, enough to keep going. Because in the dead of winter, Viking food was never about pleasure, it was about survival. All summer and fall, families had worked to preserve what they could. In January, the larders were dim, cold places lined with clay pots, leather sacks, and wooden casks. Breakfast, if it could be called that, might be thin porridge made from barley or oats. And always, what if there was fish, dried or salted, it would be torn into chewy strips. Children chewed on hardened cheese, nearly rock-like from the cold. It filled their stomachs, slowly, without taste, but it gave them strength. Lunch and dinner were hardly different. Stews were popular, if you had something to stew. Bones boiled for hours. There was no sugar, no spice, no luxury. In fact, spices were so rare in Viking Scandinavia that they were almost mythical. Still, meals were communal. People sat together around the fire, shared bowls. On feast days, they might thaw a small store of mead, fermented honey wine. Sometimes, if the hunt had gone well, a hare or wild bird might be stewed with dried apples or preserved berries from the fall. But those days were rare. For most of the winter, Viking meals were repetitive, bland, and cold. And yet, they survived. Because winter wasn't a time of abundance. In every bite, there was caution, gratitude, memory, and hope for spring. The wind howls outside the wooden walls. It claws at the thatch, rattles the doors, and swirls fine powdery snow under every crack and crevice. There's warmth, not just from the fire, but from what people wear. Because surviving winter in the north wasn't just about having shelter, it was about wearing it. Clothing, for the Vikings, wasn't fashion, it was armor against the cold. Let's begin with the base layer. Beneath it all, most people wore linen or woolen tunics. Simple, soft garments that sat close to the skin. Wool was the Vikings' secret weapon, naturally insulating, breathable, and still warm when wet. These were often undyed, woven in earthy tones of browns, greys, and muted greens. Dyed clothes existed, but in winter, it was practicality over beauty. Linen, made from flax, wasn't quite as insulating, but it was light and durable, often used in summer, but layered underneath in winter. They were often tied with bands of wool or leather thongs just below the knees to keep them snug and to trap body heat. Over that, they'd add a thicker woolen tunic or They weren't waterproof in the modern sense, but they were carefully oiled to keep moisture out as much as possible. When they did exist, they were woolen and hand-knitted, sometimes woven in intricate patterns, passed down for generations. More often, people simply wrapped their feet in woolen rags. Trousers were made of thick wool or felted cloth, sometimes even leather, depending on what was available. Men and women wore woolen caps, fur hoods, and wrapped scarves. Often multiple layers at once, A well-made hood could also cover the shoulders and upper chest, adding even more insulation. So people bundled themselves in all they had, huddled beside one another, and waited out the long nights. Some were two-fingered to allow for better grip while using tools or handling reins. Others were simple bags of warmth tied at the wrists. When blizzards rolled in from the mountains or the sea, people relied on fur garments, full robes, tunics. You didn't survive the cold, you wore your way through it. A patchwork of wool, linen, and fur, wrapped tightly around small bodies to keep out the biting cold. Without it, the longhouse was little more than a barn of frozen timber. With it, it was life itself, stone-lined and kept low. It allowed heat to radiate gently outward, never blazing too high, but never allowed to go out. But in the very center of the Viking longhouse, glowing, crackling, and alive, there is fire, and coats made from the skins of animals they'd hunted. A wife, a child, a servant. It didn't matter who. The fire could not be left alone. Scraps, burlap, old sails, frayed cloaks. There was no shame in wearing something tattered, only in freezing. Vikings gathered it in warmer months from nearby bogs, shaping it into bricks, then stacking and drying it for the cold season. Families covered them with ash to insulate the heat, then stirred them back to life, come morning. A ritual as old as fire itself. A hole in the roof. Not exactly a chimney, but a simple vent to let smoke escape. Though escape is a generous word. Viking longhouses were famously smoky, the air thick and heavy, especially in winter when doors and windows were sealed tight. Elders warmed their bones with a bowl of broth or a carved cup of warm mead. Tools were repaired, garments mended, stories told. It was here that runes were carved, games played, songs sung in low voices. The goddess Frigg, wife of Odin, was said to preside over hearth and home. Some Vikings believed their household spirits lived in the embers, guardians of luck and fortune. And moss, to light another hearth, to bring warmth to a neighbor's home, or to rekindle fire after a journey. To carry fire was to carry life. Bread was baked on flat stones or in clay ovens nestled into the coals. It didn't burn as hot as wood, but it smoldered slow and steady, perfect for keeping a hearth alive through the night. And it clung to the wooden beams, blackening them over time. A kind of ancient seasoning that gave the house its scent, its texture, even its spirit. Reindeer fur was especially prized. Warm, thick, and lightweight. But at the center of it all, low and glowing, the fire remained, often made of wool, woven thick and fastened at the shoulder with a brooch. Sometimes symbols of luck, sometimes protective runes. Even in the hardest months, Vikings held on to the threads of tradition, identity, and meaning. In the worst weather, cloaks would be fur-lined, using pelts from animals like sheep, fox, reindeer, or bear. Some cloaks were waterproofed with oils or fats. Others were layered 2 or 3 thick. Now for the outer layers, Vikings wore cloaks. Heavy ones, but cloaks had their limits. Even children wore layers, often hand-me-downs stitched and restitched by mothers, grandmothers, or older siblings. Feet were another battle. Viking boots were usually made of soft leather, lined with sheepskin, and stuffed with straw, moss, or animal hair for insulation. Yes, they existed too, made from fur or thick wool. And then there were head coverings. In a land where the heat escapes quickest from the top of the body, covering the head was essential. But for those who couldn't afford fur, or had lost livestock to disease or raiders, winter clothes were patched together from whatever was at hand. Blankets were few, and firewood had to be conserved. Still, there were signs of beauty, even in survival. Many cloaks and tunics were decorated with simple embroidery. Clothes told stories of family, of struggle, of skill, and of the unspoken truth that in Viking lands, the cold outside is relentless. It pushes at the walls, seeps beneath the door, curls through the gaps in the wooden slats. It wasn't just a place for cooking, it was the very heart of the home. The hearth was typically a long, narrow strip of fire set directly into the floor, running down the center of the building, because letting the fire die in winter could mean more than inconvenience. It could mean death. In the darkest months, when the days were only a few hours long, someone was always tending the flame. Dried peat was often burned. When wood was scarce, they also used driftwood, animal dung, and wood chips from boat building or carpentry. But the key was the embers. At night, the flame itself could die down, but the glowing coals had to be protected, and above the hearth. But smoke had its uses. It helped preserve meat. It killed pests. Around the hearth, life revolved. Meals were prepared in iron cauldrons suspended from chains, bubbling slowly with stews of meat, grains, and vegetables. Children played nearby, or napped on fur rugs. It was warmth in every sense. The hearth also had spiritual weight. In Norse culture, fire was sacred. It connected the world of the living to the gods. And so, the fire was treated with respect. It wasn't simply practical, it was powerful. Sometimes a single glowing coal would be carried, carefully cradled in ash at night. The longhouse would fall quiet. The wind might howl. The wolves might cry in the distance. Constant, steady, and ancient. A thread of warmth that stretched across generations, from frostbitten winters to memory itself. Imagine the wind coming in off the fjord, sharp as a blade, laced with salt and cold. The water beyond is dark, almost black, and capped with white. The longboats are moored for the season, ice beginning to gather around their hulls. The sea is no longer a path. It's a barrier, but even when frozen, the sea still feeds. Fish, more than any other food, sustained the Norse people through winter. When farming lay dormant and game was scarce, the preserved catch of warmer months was what kept bellies full, or at least not empty. They traveled far in their sturdy boats, casting nets and lines into cold northern waters that teemed with life. In spring and summer, Viking fishermen harvested in great numbers. Cod, herring, salmon, haddock, and even eel. But the key to surviving winter wasn't just catching the fish, it was preserving it. These structures, called hiel, were found along the coast, a forest of fish gently swaying in the breeze. The Vikings were masters of preservation. Drying was the most common method. Cod, in particular, was often split open, gutted, and hung from wooden racks in the icy, salty air. No fire was needed. The Vikings turned to the last resort, fermentation. Fish or meat was packed into barrels with layers of salt, which drew out moisture and killed bacteria. Salted herring became a staple in wealthier Norse homes. The result was sharp, sour, and utterly no spices, nothing was wasted. Every scrap of flesh, fat, and bone had a purpose. To fill a stomach, to sustain the body, to push life just a little farther into the thaw. And come winter, it could be boiled back to life over the hearth, softened with broth or ale, and eaten with bread or pot. Just time and cold and patience. Not in elaborate prayers, but in quiet rituals. A nod to the gods, a carved rune on the bowl, a muttered word of gratitude to the sea or the beast. The result was stockfish. Dry as bark, tough as leather, but it could last for years if stored properly. Then there was salting. Salt wasn't cheap, but when available, it added variety. The Norse raised hardy breeds that could withstand snow-covered fields and chilly nights. Flax might be used for undergarments or finer tunics, but wool was king. Their wool was coarse and greasy, but incredibly durable, perfect for spinning into thick, warm thread. Men wore long tunics, often reaching mid-thigh or lower, belted at the waist. For most, though it was simple, sheepskin or layered wool, function mattered more than display. Underneath, linen undershirts offered a lighter barrier, though rare in the winter months. But for most, it was the dried fish, hard, flaking, chewy, that made up the evening meal. These cloaks were rectangular, pinned at one shoulder with a brooch, and could be pulled tightly around the body or thrown over both shoulders. They acted like a blanket, easily adjusted for wind and snow. In Iceland, Lopapeysa-style hoods and cowls eventually emerged. Early versions of the snow hoods we'd wear today. Married women kept their heads covered, and the layers helped trap warmth around the neck and shoulders. Heavy cloaks were shared across genders. Warmth had no rank. Even if never truly full, the family would drift into sleep with the faint taste of fish lingering on their tongues, just the raw materials of the land and the slow, painstaking work of transforming them into armor against the cold. That smoky smell wasn't unpleasant, it was protective. Every stitch, every seam, woven with hours of effort. Sometimes days, by firelight, in stillness, surrounded by the sounds of spinning wheels and softly murmured conversation. Most simply kept their hands tucked beneath their cloaks or sleeves. An icy ground, even the smallest embroidery, could feel like art, like something human in a season that often wasn't. tea, buckling leather around your waist and tucking your hands beneath your cloak as the long night settles in. Just warm, rough garments to keep them alive through frostbitten nights. When necessary, mittens might be sewn from scraps of felted wool or animal hide, and the promise of one more day carried softly on their breath. Decorative borders were sometimes stitched onto hymns, not for wealth, but as a quiet joy amid bleakness. The boots had to be dried by the fire each night, lest they freeze solid by morning. The firelight dances on the wooden walls of the longhouse, casting slow shadows on woolen cloaks and sheepskins hanging to dry. Underneath, some men wore woolen leg wraps, long strips wound around the lower legs for added warmth and support. The air smells faintly of lanolin, that waxy scent of raw wool, and smoke from the hearth that never quite fades. In this quiet, flickering warmth, we step into the woven world of Viking winter clothing. The texture was a challenge. It required soaking, boiling, hammering, and sometimes even beating it with a mallet just to make it chewable. Yet in the dark of January, with snow falling and wind howling, a bowl of fish stew, no matter how bland or tough, was a lifeline. And when even that was gone, in some regions, fish was buried underground or sealed in barrels to rot, a practice that led to dishes like the infamous fermented shark still found in Iceland today. To modern palates, these foods might seem like punishment, but to a Norse farmer or fisherman huddled in a smoky longhouse, they were memory and survival. The taste of summer, preserved in frost. Add to this the occasional dried reindeer, seal meat, or smoked lamb, and the winter table becomes a picture of both hardship and cleverness. And yet, even the poorest Viking might give thanks before the meal, because every bite in winter felt sacred. And when the stew was gone and the pot scraped clean and the fire burned low, bellies warmed in the harsh Scandinavian cold. Clothing wasn't fashion, it was survival. There was no synthetic fibers, no feather-done insulation, and it began with wool. Sheep were essential to Viking life, not just for meat and milk, but for their fleece. Every Viking woman knew how to card, spin, and weave. The process was meditative, rhythmic. It was woven into tunic-length cloth, dyed with natural plants, and cut to form layers of protection. Over the tunic came the cloak, the Vikings' most iconic garment. In wealthier homes, cloaks might be trimmed with fur, fox, marten, or bear, if available. Pants were woolen trousers, often loose-fitting and tied at the ankles with cords. On the feet, leather shoes, or boots, stuffed with hay moss, or scraps of fleece for insulation. Waterproofing was minimal. Gloves were rare. And then, there were the hats. No horned helmets, of course. Those are myth. But soft, woolen caps were common, tight-fitting, sometimes pointed, like a sleeping hat. For women, layers were vital. Underdresses, apron dresses, shawls, and headscarves made up the typical outfit. But more than the garments themselves, it was the layering and the constant maintenance that mattered. Wet wool was dangerous. Clothes had to be dried daily. Smoke helped, not just to dry them, but to coat the fibers in a film that helped repel water. Everything was handmade. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothes. No cute outfits, no frills. And yet, there was care. There was beauty. Dyes from plants like woad, madder, and walnut husk added soft hues of blue, red, and brown. When you wore your clothes every single day, when they kept you alive through howling winds. So next time you wrap yourself in a blanket or zip up a down jacket, imagine instead pulling a scratchy wool tunic over your head, because in Viking winter, warmth wasn't about comfort. It was about outlasting the cold. In the long, dark months of winter, the laughter of children in a Viking settlement was both a comfort and a challenge. It was the sound of life continuing, of hope in the face of the freeze, but also of small, fragile bodies, vulnerable to a season that showed no mercy. Viking childhood, even in the best of times, was fleeting and harsh. And in winter, it was a test of endurance from the very beginning. No heated blankets, just the midwife's hands, the breath of the fire, and animal pelts piled high. Infants were wrapped tightly in wool and swaddled in furs, often nestled close to their mothers to share body heat. Boys learned to carry firewood, feed animals, and watch for smoke in the distance, a sign of danger or visitors. Girls helped their mothers spin wool, stir the stew, and tend to younger siblings. Even still, many didn't survive their first winter. Newborns born in the cold months faced an immediate battle. There were no warm hospitals, but for those who did, childhood was not a protected phase. it was apprenticeship in survival. By the age of 4 or 5, Viking children had already begun to contribute to winter life. Boys practiced with bows when old enough to pull the string. Was the stillness. For weeks, the sun might rise only slightly above the horizon before slipping back down. Children had to learn patience, how to endure the quiet, how to find rhythm when time itself seemed to freeze. Girls learned how to gut a fish, skin a rabbit, and identify herbs that might stop a fever. The work wasn't constant, there was still play. But play, too, was shaped by winter's grip. Children were seen as both precious and precarious, their lives easily lost to the elements, but their spirits strong and tied to the future of the clan. In snowy villages, children carved sleds from wood and animal bone, sliding down icy hills near the long graves were dug in frozen ground with great effort, and small tokens were buried alongside. A favorite carved animal, a little pouch of herbs, a smooth river stone polished by play. They used sticks and frozen dung as makeshift balls for games of aim and agility, and sisters in shared furs, whispering secrets while the wind howled beyond the door. They kept history alive in oral form and reminded the youngest among them that they belonged to something larger than just the cold. It was full of the creaks and moans of timber, the stirring of livestock in their stalls, and the distant, eerie call of the wind over ice. Sometimes it was just the wind, but sometimes it was something else. Toy swords were shaped from driftwood, and little figures were whittled from leftover scraps, keeping tiny hands busy beside the fire. They were the reanimated corpses of greedy or vengeful souls, cursed to walk the land, swollen with decay, eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. Fires were never fully extinguished, always a little flame or coal, kept alive, to protect the sleeping. They brought disease, ruin, or madness to those they visited. But even in rest, there was always someone awake, keeping watch in the deep hours of the night, when the world outside seemed to hold its breath beneath the snow. If the fire went out, the entire longhouse might freeze. Sometimes they whispered prayers to Thor for strength, or to Frigg for protection of the home. Sometimes they sang softly, old songs meant to carry time away. If the livestock thrashed or gave birth early, help was needed, and if strangers came knocking in the dead of night, well, they were rarely welcome. By candlelight or the hearth's red glow, children listened to stories of Thor and the hammer, Odin's wisdom, and frost giants lurking in the cold. Their world was full of invisible threads, fate, spirits, omens, ancestors. That silence was feared most of all. It meant something ancient was near, something older than gods, something cold. When the snow fell heavily, muffling every sound, it was easy to believe the veil between worlds had thinned. Stories to give shape to the These weren't bedtime stories for comfort. They were survival myths. Morality, warnings in the guise of wonder. People blamed it for bad dreams, or for the feeling of paralysis upon waking. They weren't necessarily evil, but they demanded respect. Some claimed to hear hoofbeats on the snow, ghostly echoes of the wild hunt, Odin's spectral procession racing across the sky, gathering souls in its wake. A misplaced insult, a forgotten offering, or cutting down a tree they dwelt in, could invite disaster. People would murmur apologies aloud when stepping outside, just in case they were being watched. Storytelling filled the long hours indoors. Others dreamed of ancestors offering wisdom or warnings in sleep. In the Norse belief, dreams were a passageway, a way to glimpse what was coming, or understand what had been lost. The watcher stood vigil, and morning always came, pale and blue, like the edge of steel. Older family members, often grandparents or uncles, would pass the time with sagas, legends, and ancestral tales. The North believed that every child had a fylgja, a spiritual guide or guardian tied to fate. Education wasn't reading and writing, not for most. It was learning to survive. But perhaps the hardest part of Viking childhood in winter. The long nights were not just cold but endless. Darkness would fall in early afternoon and not lift until late morning. Families would sing simple lullabies and chants, some joyful, some mournful, echoing gently through the longhouse. These songs were memory. And when death did come, as it often did, through illness, accident, or exposure, it was mourned deeply but accepted as part of life. Still, not all was bleak. Winter could also be magical for a child, a time of aurora-lit skies, of animal tracks in the snow, of huddling beside brothers and when the ice began to melt. When the first signs of thaw cracked the edge of the fjord, Viking children were the first to run outside, laughing in the slush, feeling warmth on their faces for the first time in months. In their joy, there was resilience, and in their survival, the future of the Norse lived on. As the hearth dimmed and the last log hissed with melting frost, Viking households slipped into an easy slumber. Night in a Viking settlement was not silent. The Norse feared the night, not because of darkness itself, they were used to that, but because the night was believed to be the time when spirits moved most freely. It was said that Draugr, the restless dead, could rise from their burial mounds on winter nights. These weren't ghosts in white sheets. To ward them off, families placed iron nails near doorways, or carved runes into lintels and beams. Salt was sprinkled in corners. More than one person stayed up through the night, usually an elder or the strongest of the household, not out of custom, but out of necessity. The long watch was lonely. Wrapped in heavy furs, the watcher would sit near the fire, occasionally adding wood or tending coals with an iron poker. And yet, in these hours of darkness, imagination stirred. The Norse were deeply spiritual people. They feared or hidden folk, unseen beings who lived in rocks, hills, or shadows. At the edge of the settlement, deeper in the woods, or out on the fjords, it was worse. Hunters who strayed too far reported strange lights, voices calling their names, or the sudden absence of all sound, not even wind or bird. So they told stories to explain what they feared. The Nattmara, or Nightmara, was said to be a spirit that slipped in through the keyhole and sat upon your chest, stealing your breath as you slept. There were shapeshifters, ice spirits, and even tales of Loki's mischief unleashed in the dark. But not all tales were terrifying. Some spoke of loved ones returning, sitting silently by the fire, just for a moment, before fading into the shadows. In the end, despite the fear, despite the cold, they endured. The fire burned low, but it never died. And when it did, the night spirits returned to their mounds, the hidden folk to their stones, and the longhouse to its rhythm of life once more. Though the Viking world was often harsh there were moments of warmth, of joy, and of deep communal celebration. And no moment was more cherished, more deeply rooted in both tradition and necessity, than Yule, the ancient Norse winter festival. It marked the winter solstice, the darkest and coldest part of the year, when the sun barely rose and the cold had settled in like a second skin. But instead of shrinking in fear or mourning the sun's retreat, the Norse met the darkness with defiance and ritual. It was both symbolic and practical, a reason to gather, to warm, to cook, and to share stories. And above all, it was an offering to the gods. Yule wasn't just a single night, but a whole season. They lit fires, big ones. Yule fires blazed high in central hearths and outdoor pits, meant to mimic the returning sun and drive away the oppressive cold. He was said to ride across the sky on his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, watching, judging, and sometimes rewarding. Children would leave boots filled with hay or treats for Sleipnir by the hearth, a practice that echoes in modern Christmas traditions. Preserved meats, cured in smoke or salt weeks before, were brought out and slow-cooked over flame. These stories connected generations. Children drifted to sleep, listening to tales of Thor battling frost giants, or Loki's cunning schemes, or the mighty hall of Valhalla, where warriors feasted forever. Fat-rich sausages, dried fish, and roasted game filled the air with savory scent. Bones carved with symbols served as dice. Strength contests and riddles brought laughter. Even in hardship, there was room for joy. In some regions, people wore animal masks or hides, dancing and singing through the village, a ritual of fertility, of luck, and of chasing away evil. They would eat, drink, remember, and believe in gods, in each other, and in the promise that light would return. For connection. The wild joy of Yule softened into carols and nativity stories. Odin's gift-giving ride transformed into St. Nicholas. The sacred flame became a candle in a window. Ale and mead, fermented during the warmer months, were tapped and passed freely. And always there was bread, flat, dense, hearty, inside. The heat and cheer of the longhouse felt eternal. For just a moment, the world was safe. Their fleece grew in layers, an oily outer layer that shed water, and a soft inner undercoat, ideal for insulation. Then it was carded, using wooden paddles embedded with sharp wire teeth to untangle the fibers and align them into soft rolls, called When the days shortened and the frost crept in, this wall became a lifeline. Odin, the Allfather, was deeply associated with Yule. The motion was hypnotic. like the ticking of a clock or the sway of a ship at sea. The spindle would dangle, slowly spinning, drawing the wool into an ever finer thread. The feasting, however, was central. Patterns were woven into cloaks, stripes, checks, and borders told of region, family, or fortune. Dyes were used from plants, lichens, and even insects to add color to winter's gray. Animals were offered to the gods in thanks for survival so far, and in hope for a bountiful year to come. The Viking loom was an upright tool called a warp-weighted loom, where vertical threads, the warp, were held taut by stones, and horizontal threads, the weft, were passed through by hand. Row by row, inch by inch, yards of fabric emerged from the slow labor. It could even be felted, compressed with moisture and pressure into a dense, windproof fabric perfect for winter out. In wealthier households, fur-lined mantles became a mark of prestige, but for most, it was wool. Coarse, practical, and made with care. And the skills were taught early. Little girls learned to spin before they could read, their small hands mimicking their mothers, preparing for the long cold to come. Their meat became part of the feast, their blood smeared symbolically on tools, doors, or altars. But inside, warm, under thick cloaks, and sleeping on wool-filled bedding, the Vikings endured. Even in a time of scarcity, communities would pool resources to make the Yule feast special. In a world where nature was often cruel, it was an act of quiet defiance to take the fleece of a sheep, the gift of the land, and turn it into armor against the wind. But food wasn't the only focus. Yule was deeply spiritual. Blood sacrifices, known as were sometimes performed, especially in older, more rural traditions. But that tunic, thick and layered, could mean the difference between frostbite and survival. Runes were cast, omens read, and songs sung into the dark. While Viking warriors might be remembered in sagas for their battles, the unsung heroes of the long winters were often those who spun the threads, quite literally, that kept families alive. It was a time when the veil between the worlds was thinnest, when the spirits of ancestors were welcome to join the celebration. Families sometimes left a plate of food out overnight, just in case a wandering spirit wished to taste the warmth of the living. Storytelling was a crucial part of the night. Wrapped in cloaks beside the hearth, people shared long sagas, tales of gods and giants, heroes and fools, shipwrecks and revenge. Games were played. Outside, the world was silent. Snow fell gently in the woods, muffling the earth like a great white quilt. Yule could last for several days, even 12, in some communities. Each night, the fire was rekindled. Each morning, offerings made. In later centuries, many of these customs would blend into Christian traditions, but at its heart, Yule remained the same. A refusal to surrender to the cold, a declaration that, no matter how dark or brutal the winter, people would gather. So the Vikings survived the coldest nights not only with tools and firewood, but with tradition, with story, and with celebration. And perhaps that is the deepest warmth of all. If survival in the Viking world demanded resilience, it also required ingenuity. And nowhere was this clearer than in the quiet, repetitive rhythm of spinning wool and weaving cloth. Wool was everything. Sheep were among the most valuable livestock in the Norse world, not just for their meat or milk, but for their thick, resilient coats. First, it had to be clean. That meant soaking, beating, and rinsing out the lanolin, dirt, and debris. Not exactly glamorous work, but absolutely vital. Then came the spinning. A woman, and it was usually women, would sit by the fire, spindle in hand, gently twisting the roving into thread. This thread would be wound onto a distaff or wrapped into a ball, ready for weaving. Weaving was another quiet triumph. What they wove wasn't just utilitarian. Though necessity drove production, artistry found its place, even in the darkest months. Red from madder root, blue from woad, yellow from birch leaves, black from iron and oak galls. It was slow work, weeks, sometimes months, to produce enough for a single tunic. Wool wasn't limited to clothing. It lined shoes, covered beds, made sacks and blankets and cloaks. Children wore hand-me-downs, patched over and over. Adults, layered, underclothes, tunics, cloaks. The tools used, spindles, cards, looms, were often passed down through generations, smooth with use and love. Weaving was more than survival. It was a kind of ritual, a connection across seasons and generations. By firelight, surrounded by the rhythm of hands and thread, the longhouse became a kind of cocoon. Outside, the storm might howl. With every thread they spun, they wove not just cloth, but hope. In the still, sharp cold of a Viking winter, food wasn't just nourishment, it was survival insurance. Every meal was the result of months of preparation, preservation, and planning. Because once the ice came, the fjords froze, and the fields slept. There was no gathering, no planting, and little hunting to be done. The Vikings were master fishermen, hauling in cod, herring, and flatfish during the warmer months. But fresh fish spoiled fast, especially without refrigeration. So they turned to the sea's own remedy, salt. You ate what you had stored, or you didn't eat at all. When available, fish were cleaned, rubbed down with salt, and packed tightly into barrels. There, they would rest, curing slowly into a dense, salty form that could last for months, even into the next spring. Preservation was both an art and a necessity. Cod, split and cleaned, was hung on wooden racks in the biting Arctic wind. Over weeks, the cold, dry air would pull the moisture from the flesh, transforming it into something tough, leathery and meat was smoked in special huts where low fires smoldered for days. Cabbage and turnips were shredded, salted, and packed into barrels, left to ferment into sharp sauerkrauts. Not exactly a feast, but a source of vitamins in the darkest season. The smoke dried the meat, flavored it, and kept rot at bay. Smoked lamb, smoked pork, even smoked whale meat in coastal areas, all found their way into storage pits, cellars, and hanging rafters. Loaves were baked flat, dense, and tough, more like hard tack than modern bread. These were dried near the fire and stored in stacks, slowly gnawed down over the winter. A bowl of pottage in the morning, perhaps a stew of dried peas, lard, and onions. Salted fish at night. And now they had enough, just enough to make it through until the thaw. And they were sustainable, passed down over generations, refined with each harsh winter. Skyer, if they were lucky, a sliver of dried meat, a crust of bread softened in hot water, over and over, until spring. And in the dark of winter, that mythology felt especially close. Sour his might was comforting when storms lashed the coast, and frost threatened the livestock. In the flicker of the hearth, children listened wide-eyed tales of him battling the frost giants, beings made of ice, cold, and old hatred. If they caught their prey, the world would fall into darkness, an omen of Ragnarok, the end of all things. In winter, when food ran low and illness crept in, Vikings whispered his name, asking for strength, insight, or the courage to endure. He had hung himself on the world tree to gain knowledge, and in their own way, so did they, sacrificing comfort for survival. Every sunrise was a small victory, a sign that the gods still held the world together. Smoky, the mountains and forests were full of unseen beings, or land spirits, who could be either helpful or vengeful. Every action, chopping wood, tending livestock, even stirring the cooking pot, had a place in the mythic rhythm of the world. Life was hard, but it had meaning. Struggle wasn't just pain, it was part of a divine cycle. Offerings of bread, milk, or even a lock of hair were left for them, particularly at the start of winter. Their ancestors were watching, the gods were near, and the sun chased but unbeaten would rise again. Angering them could mean failed hunts, broken tools, or worse, salty. These weren't just ghost tales. They reflected very real fears about the unknown, illness, and isolation. It was also about belief, about invoking meaning in the freezing silence, and finding strength in stories passed down through generations. But they were the flavors of survival. Families lit fires and drank strong ale, not just for warmth, but to summon back the sun. It was a celebration of life in the face of death. They decorated with evergreen boughs, symbols of endurance, and sang songs to welcome back the light. Some added tree bark or ground up acorns to stretch the flower, especially in lean years. Stockfish, they called it. Hard as a board, it needed soaking and beating to be edible again, but it lasted through even the cruelest snowstorms. Let's begin with fish, the lifeblood of Norse coastal life. Salt was precious. It had to be gathered painstakingly from seawater or traded for inland. They turned to their gods, but even without salt, they had a method. Then there was meat. When animals were slaughtered in late autumn, pigs, goats, even the occasional cow, every part was used. But instead of letting it spoil, Viking households turned it into something usable. Skyer, a thick, cultured dairy similar to yogurt, was a favorite. Tangy, filling, and long. Sky air could be kept for weeks, and was often mixed with dried berries or honey for flavor. Butter, another staple, was churned and stored in crocks, often salted for preservation. Sometimes they buried it, sealed in barrels or wrapped in hides, deep in the frozen ground. Primitive refrigeration. Crude, but effective. Dairy products also underwent their own transformations. Fresh milk soured quickly. Then came fermentation. The Vikings, like many early cultures, knew the magic of microbes, even if they didn't understand the science. And, of course, there was bread. Flour from barley, rye, or oats was precious. There were no daily feasts, no bottomless supplies. Meals were small, infrequent, and repetitive. Yet, in all this hardship, there was a kind of culinary wisdom. The methods were crude, but effective. The flavors were strong. Even in the darkest night, the Vikings could sit around their hearth bowl in hand. When the snow was thick on the ground and the wind howled like wolves outside, the Vikings turned to something older than fire, older than memory. To survive a Viking winter wasn't only about stockpiling food or huddling near the hearth. Norse mythology, rich and visceral, painted the world as a cosmic battlefield between chaos and order, frost and flame. The long nights were said to be the domain of Skarl and Hati, the wolves that chased the sun and moon through the sky. The people paid quiet homage to Thor, the thunder god, whose hammer protected them from giants and misfortune. Odin, the All-Father, was the god of wisdom and sacrifice. Households would carve runes onto doorposts or wear small talismans, believing they offered protection from both spirits and the elements. These weren't casual superstitions. They were lifelines. The harsh landscape was never just nature, it was alive. In some regions, there were stories of Droga, undead figures, who rose from their graves in the long winter nights to haunt the living. But it wasn't all fear. There was also hope. The promise of Yule. Yule was more than just a feast. It was a sacred observance of the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. Some of these traditions echo even now, in Christmas trees, in carols, in the Yule log. Remnants of Viking resilience woven into modern culture. These spiritual beliefs weren't separate from daily life. They were fused with it. And when the nights felt longest, when the storms raged and the horizon disappeared in white, Vikings didn't feel alone. So they endured, they prayed, they sacrificed, they told stories, and in doing so, they passed along dark nights with a warmth that no fire could give. At long last, the ice began to loosen its grip. In the quiet spaces between snowdrifts, a green shoot would sometimes appear. Fragile, stubborn, almost miraculous. The rivers, long frozen into stillness, began to groan and shift, cracking like thunder as the melt began. The wind soft, birds returned to the sky, and the long silence of winter slowly gave way to the murmur of spring. Children who had stayed indoors for weeks ran wild outside, chasing geese and laughter. The sea ice retreated from the coastlines, opening paths for fishing, sailing, and trade once more. What had the cold claimed? A roof lost to snow, a neighbor fallen to sickness, a weakened ox, a dwindling seed store. Every household made a quiet inventory of loss, but also of gratitude. They had made it. For the Vikings, surviving winter was never guaranteed. Every spring was a quiet triumph, not just over the cold, but over death itself. Immediate, exhausting, joyful work. Livestock had to be let out, pens cleaned, and fishing lines mended. Plows returned to the fields, sails were checked for holes, smokehouses restocked. The people came alive with the land. For the stacking of wood in summer, the salting of meat in fall, the prayers whispered to Odin, and the songs sung over the embers. They celebrated with movement, with life. A new cycle began. The world changed with the thaw. The earth, hard as stone for months, became soft again beneath the feet. They had faced the long dark and come through the other side. But spring didn't just mean warmth, it meant work. It was time to check the damage. If this story helped you relax, drift off, or simply reflect, consider subscribing to Boring History for sleep. Your support helps keep the hearth warm and the stories flowing. It wasn't sudden, it crept in like breath after holding it too long. Babies born in the dark days of January now saw their first sunlight. The Vikings have survived the winter, and so have you. The old clutched their cloaks tighter but smiled more. The young felt the surge of life, urgent and golden. Stories were told in the long twilight evenings, not only of gods and monsters, but of the winter just past, of the night the hearthstone cracked, of the strange noise heard in the forest, of the stew that stretched just far enough. These tales became part of the family's shared memory, growing richer each time they were retold. The arrival of spring was not marked by a single date, but by sensations. The first drip from the eaves, the first day the sun warmed bare skin, the scent of earth returning to the air. In the villages and homesteads, people gathered again in outdoor spaces, reunions, trades, the forging of new alliances, and through it all, one truth stood tall. To survive winter in the Viking world was to be reborn. Spring wasn't just a season, it was the reward for labor, patience, preparation, faith. When the fjords shimmered again and the boats slipped back into the sea, the Vikings did not celebrate with and so, the coldest nights passed into memory, etched deep into the bones of the people who endured them. And now, with the earth soft beneath their feet and the sun rising higher each day, they looked to the horizon and onward. Thank you for listening to this calming journey into the Viking past. Close your eyes now. Good night.